Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. In this video, we are going to see how to build APIs using a Spring Boot framework and then secure those APIs using the access tokens obtained from Auth0 identity provider using the OAuth 2.0 client credentials grant. Auth0 is one of the most widely used identity product in the industry, especially for consumer identity and access management, which you can even call it as customer identity and access management. Uh, and it has very good support for OAuth 2.0 OpenID Connect as well as SAML. And so here we are going to see how to get an access token from Auth0 using the client credentials OAuth 2.0 grant and then use those access token to call the APIs that are built using a Spring Boot framework. So before getting into the end-to-end configuration, where I will show you how to configure this entire setup in Auth0 and then build a Spring Boot app from scratch and then secure the APIs in that Spring Boot app using Auth0 access token, let's quickly go through this end-to-end flow. So you have a client application, which can be any client, a desktop client or mobile app, or it can be a web application or a single page app hosted in a single page app. It can be anything. So that client application is when it is trying to call an API that is hosted, say, in a Spring Boot app, the Java Spring Boot framework, it needs to now call the API using some token, right? So basically, if it is a API which is exposing some sensitive data, you need to add some kind of authorization layer around that API to make sure hackers don't get those data, right? So in order to secure those APIs, you need to add some kind of authorization layer. And what we are going to do is basically we are going to add the authorization layer using the JWT tokens. And this JWT token will be generated by the Auth0 identity provider using the OAuth 2.0 client credentials grant. So the client app will first get the access token from Auth0 using the client credentials grant, and that will be a JWT access token. And then it will pass that access token to Spring Boot app in the authorization header, and the Spring Boot app will then validate the token. Basically, it will validate the some of the claims like the audience claim, this scope claim, and it will also check the signature. So if the signature is not valid, it will consider it as an invalid token and it will return a 401 error. Or if the token already expired, based on the expiry attribute in the token, if the token already expired, then it will again return a 401 error. But if the token is valid and the scopes are valid and the claims are valid, then it will return a HTTP 200 response with the like with the API data, like whatever data you requested in that API. And if the token is valid but the token doesn't have the required permissions to call the APIs, then it will return a 403 forbidden error. So we will see all these scenarios when we build the app from the scratch. As of now, this is the end-to-end flow. So before getting into the configuration, I request you to kindly subscribe to this channel and support this channel. So now let's get into the configuration steps. So this is the Auth0 developer account which I created. So anyone can go ahead and register a developer account in Auth0. It's totally free. You can just go to auth0.com and then sign up for a developer account using your Gmail credentials or Microsoft credentials. So you can just register for it. And once you log into your Auth0 account, you will see this management console, Auth0 management console, where we will be making some changes to create the client app and the API app configuration and then get access token from Auth0. So let's actually do that. So the first step we are going to do is basically create the client app and the Spring Boot app configuration in Auth0. So when I'm creating a client app and a Spring Boot app configuration in Auth0, it's basically like the applications that we create here in Auth0 represents that client app and the Spring Boot app. And when we build that Spring Boot app, we will again link the Spring Boot app with the Auth0 URLs, the Auth0 endpoints, so that it will automatically do the token validations, all those things. But we will get to those things later on. As of now, let's go ahead and create the API app, which represents this Spring Boot app, and a client app, which represents this client app in the Auth0 console. So first, let's create an API. So go to the applications API in your Auth0 console and create API. Let's just for easy understanding, let's call it as a user API. And for the identifier, you can give any URL. So it doesn't really matter. It's just an identifier. So let me actually give it as // user API and create. So the API got created. API in the sense an API application configuration got created in Auth0. Now let's add a couple of permissions to this API app, which basically represents OAuth 2.0 scopes. And we will see that when we generate the access token. So let's call it as read user permission, which basically read user details. And we will add update user, which will be an update user details. So we added a couple of permissions here. So what we did right now is we created an application in Auth0 which represents this Spring Boot API app. And we added a couple of permissions to that API app, which is read user and update user. So what we will do is when we build this Spring Boot app, we will expose a couple of APIs called read user and update user, and then try to secure those APIs using these permissions. And we will see that during the testing. Now let's go ahead and create a client app. So go to applications/applications and name it as, let's name it as client app 1. And this is going to be a client credentials grant. So that is called as, in other words, it is called as a mission to mission API. Mission to not API, mission to mission applications. So why it is called as mission to mission is because in the case of client credentials grant, there is no user involved. It's just the client app directly contacts the identity provider using the client ID and secret to get the access token. There is no user involved in this interaction. So let's create it. So here it will ask for which APIs this particular client app can access. So in our case, it is going to be the user API. And as of now, what I will do is I will just give this particular permission, which is read user and not update user. And I will explain why. This is only for the testing purpose. So let's start with the minimum set of permissions, which is read user. Click authorize. And now you have the client app generated. So now you can go ahead and generate an access token using this client app and see what all scopes are available in that access token. So the good thing is Auth0 already provides the curl command. Just copy the curl command and go to your Postman. So you can execute the curl command from command prompt, but just for simplicity, I'm using this. So just go here, go to raw text, paste it and continue and import. So you have the curl command, you just import, copy, paste and import it, and it will automatically open a new tab in your Postman and show all the parameters of this curl command. So now you can just click send and you should get an access token. Yes, I got it. So copy this access token, go back to your browser and open the jwt.io and see what are all the details that is available in this access token. So you can see the audience, which represents that user API app that we created, which is, and I gave an identifier of HTTPS:/user API. That's what you see here in the audience. And then you have the standard parameters like IAT, the expiry, all those things. And then if you look at the scope, it has only read user permission and no update user permission. So now we are done with the Auth0 configuration. So what we basically did, again, to summarize, is basically I created a client app in Auth0, which represents the client app in this diagram. I created an API app, which represents the SpringBoot API app in Auth0. And I provided permissions to this client app to call this API app, basically only the read user API and not the update user API. So now what we need to do is build a Spring Boot API app, which exposes a couple of APIs called read user and update user, and then secure that API app using Auth0 identity provider, so that when the client app passes the access token in the header to this API app, it can validate those access tokens as well as the scopes, and then allow or deny access to the client app. So let's go to Spring Tool Suite. So I'm using Spring Tool Suite for building this Spring Boot app, and you are free to use any IDE that supports Spring Framework like Eclipse, IntelliJ, any IDE for that matter. So let's create a new Spring Starter project. Let's use the type Maven. Let's name it as SB Auth0 client and click next. Search for security and select Spring Security and OAuth2 resource server, and select web and select Spring Web. So you should see Spring Security, OAuth2 resource server, and Spring Web on the right side. Click finish. It will take a minute to provision the project, add the necessary dependencies, and then build the project. So let's wait for that. So while doing that, let's open the Spring Boot OAuth2 security official documentation. I am just going to use the documentation to show you how to build this app. So if you come to this documentation, you can go to the OAuth2 resource server and select JWT. So we are going to follow some of the instructions that are specified here in this documentation, official documentation, to build this app and then link it with Auth0 identity provider so that it is secured using the Auth0 tokens. So looks like the app got created, and you can open this main class, the main application class. Yeah, so you can see the main application class here. It automatically got provision. Now let's create a couple of APIs, get user and post user. Let's call this class name as user controller. So in order to create an API in Spring Boot, you need to annotate the class with REST controller. Let's, yeah, so I got it. And let's create a couple of methods called public string get user and return. I'm just going to return a static string called access granted get user details. But ideally what you'll be doing here is read some DB using user ID or username and return the user details. So that's what we generally do here, but in this video we are only focusing on how to secure these APIs, so I'm not going into the in-depth details on how to write all those logic. So now let's expose this method as an API. So in order to do that, use the annotation called get mapping and specify the path as /user. Now let's create one more method called update user, and let's return similar static string called update user details. And this one will be a post mapping because it will be a post API. In this case, we are calling it as update user, so it's a post API. And again, same /user. So now we have created a REST controller class and exposed a couple of APIs. One is get user, one is post user, which is basically update user. Now let's start this application and try to access these two APIs. So the application started. So let's actually open a new tab and do a http:// the default port is 8080 slash user. Oh, I actually gave a caps. Let's just keep it as lowercase and restart the application. So I get a 401 unauthorized error, and I will tell you the reason why we are getting that. Let's open one more tab and select post and same user. Again, we will get a 401 unauthorized. So the reason why we are getting a 401 unauthorized is because when we add the security dependencies in the Spring Boot app, by default, it will secure all the endpoints that are exposed in this app. So that is the beauty of Spring framework. So let's actually try one more thing. So let's actually comment these two dependencies, which are the security level dependencies, security dependency libraries for Spring Boot. And let's actually start this application and see what happens. So let's give it a try. So now I got the response. So when I hit the post user, I get access granted, update user details, and get user details. So that is because I commented out. So now you can understand, like you will understand why it was giving 401 unauthorized is because when you add these security dependencies, by default, Spring Boot will secure all its endpoints, which is a really good thing. And that is the best thing about these frameworks like Spring Boot, which allows you to build security from scratch. So build a secure app from the scratch. So now again I uncommented it, and now if I try to hit it, I will get 401 unauthorized and 401 unauthorized. So now let's associate this Spring app with the Auth0 identity provider, which is my developer tenant, Auth0 developer tenant. In your case, it will be your developer tenant. So now let's see how to do this, how to associate these two apps so that this Spring Boot security app can understand the tokens that are generated by Auth0 and then allow or deny access based on those tokens. So the first step that I want to do is to rename this as application.yaml instead of application.properties because I prefer the YAML format, and that's why I'm just renaming it as application.yaml. And also the official documentation, if you see the instructions, most of the instructions are available in the YAML format, so it's better you rename it as application.yaml. Now, in order to add the identity provider configuration in your Spring Boot app, you need to specify the issuer URI. So copy this and paste it here, and you need to replace this issuer URI with your Auth0 tenants issuer URI. So how to get that issuer URI? The most easiest way to get that issue URI is basically if you see your JWT token, you have that ISS attribute. So copy that and paste it. And let's do one more change. If you look at this documentation, you can even add one more additional validation like audience. So if you scroll down here, yeah, you can specify which audience values are accepted by this Spring Boot app. So in our case, if you look at the audience, it is that HTTPS user API. So copy that, paste it here. So what we have done here is basically this Spring Boot app will only accept tokens that are generated by this issuer, which is my developer tenant or Auth0 developer tenant. So you can see my developer tenant's ID, and here you can see it matches with that. So this Spring Boot app will only accept tokens that are generated by my Auth0 developer tenant. In your case, your Auth0 developer tenant, and it will only accept tokens with audience value of user API, which basically means like if you are generating a token for some other API app, it won't get accepted, even if it is generated by this issuer. So it will only accept tokens that are generated by this issuer and the tokens that are generated for this audience. So now let's again stop the application, restart, and now let's see that magic of like how everything works. So now again, sorry, you can, so now you can check whether the response is still 401. Yes, it is still 401. So now we will get a new token from Auth0. So I got this JWT token from Auth0. Let's pass this token in the header. So the way you pass this token is in the authorization header, and the value will be bearer space the token value and click send. So now I'm able to access my get user API by passing this token. The reason it worked is because now the Spring Boot app has started accepting the token generated from my Auth0 developer tenant. And similarly here, use that same header. Oh, sorry, go to headers, authorization, bearer, space JWT token. Now you have the access token. Now you have the access granted message. So in order to verify whether this is really working, just do a minor change here. Let's delete this letter I from here. So my tokens audience will not match with this one. So ideally it should fail. Let's see if it fails. Click send. Yes, I got a 401 unauthorized, and here also I will get a 4. That's because I deleted that one letter and my token audience didn't match with that. So just undo that change. So now let's add one more layer of validation. Now what happens is, if you look at this diagram, we have completed the configuration in Auth0 side. We have built a Spring Boot app, exposed a couple of APIs. The step 4 is also working fine, except for one condition, which is the scope condition. So currently what step 4 is doing is it's validating the JWT access token, the signatures, all those things. But step 4, it's not validating scope because we didn't do that configuration yet. So now let's see how to add scope validation so that only an access token that has the required permissions can call these APIs. So in order to do that, go to your Spring Boot documentation again, search for pre-authorize. So we need to add this pre-authorize, this syntax has authority, this particular scope, then only that particular API can be called. But before doing that, we need to enable method security in our application. So in order to do that, go to authorization, method security, and here you can see you need to add this annotation in your application, enable method security. So let's go back to our application and add that. So the enable method security annotation is added. Now go back to your documentation, go back to the previous page, and we need to add this hash pre-authorize. And let's import this. And this will be scope underscore read user, and this will be scope underscore update user. So if you remember, when we created the API app in Auth0, if you look at this API app in Auth0, we added couple of permissions called read user and update user. So here what I'm doing is, by adding this pre-authorized configuration, I'm saying that get user method can be accessed only if your access token has the read user scope. And similarly, update user can be accessed only if your access token has update user scope. And if you remember again, in our application, we only provided the read users access to this client app. And that's why this access token has only read user scope and no update user scope. We can add it later and see. As of now, let's again restart the application and see how it changes. So now, using that same access token that was generated in the previous step, if I access get user, I get a get user details response. Now if I try to access post user, I get a 403 forbidden error. So if you look at this diagram again, as I mentioned during the start of this video, you will get a 403 when the token is valid, but the token doesn't have the required permissions to call your API. And that's what is happening right now. So the token currently has only read user access, but it can't call the update user API. So now let's change the Auth0 configuration to add update user permissions to this client application, so that this client application can call both the APIs. So go to this APIs tab in your client app one and select update user and select update. So the scopes were successfully added. Now let's generate a new access token using that same command. And let's check this access token's scopes. So now you can see read user and update user scope. So now let's see what happens with this new token. Read user anyway worked even with the previous token, so it will surely work with the current token. Update user gave a 403 forbidden error with the previous token. We can check it again. Now let's replace this token and call update user. Now we are getting update user details response. So this is how you build a Spring Boot app, basically a Spring Boot API app, and then secure the app using the access tokens generated by Auth0 identity provider. So you can even extend this same use case to the access tokens that are generated for user login. So in this case, I'm using client credentials, but if you want to use a different grant called authorization code grant, where user authentication is involved before the access tokens are generated, you can do that as well and use those access tokens to call the API app, and it will still work exactly the same way that is working now. So there are multiple steps involved, and if you face any issues, please feel free to post your questions or the issue that you are facing, and I will try my best to respond to you and resolve that issue. Again, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and support this channel. Thank you.